Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Walking the Talk for Organizations Working to Address Health Inequities. I'd like to start just in case this is your first webinar, just to orient you to your webinar screen and to who we are as an organization. So at the top of your screen, you'll see a My Mood icon just above the slides. And if you hover your mouse over that, you'll see some options appear. I'm fine, raise your hand, yes, no. This is what we'll use in the question and answer portion of the webinar a little bit later. Or if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I'll see the hand by your name, and then we can either have you ask the question through your audio connection or type your question into the chat window that's on the left-hand side of your screen. Just to make sure that's working, could I have you go to the My Mood and give me a thumbs up or a I'm fine there, just so I can make sure it's working. Wonderful. Thank you. So today's webinar, again, just in case you're new, Equiate, we host free webinars every month. It's part of what we do as a service to those working to address health and social problems. If this is your first webinar with us, we're glad you're here. We're a relatively new organization. We're a consulting firm based in Alberta, Canada, focused on solving social problems with a particular emphasis on inequity and the health or social gradient. So it ties in nicely to today's topic. My name is Steve Peterson. I'm the founder and managing partner of Equiate. I'll be your webinar host this morning. If you've been following the news, Alberta's had some flooding recently. I know, Chris, we have one participant from Rocky Mountain House, and I hope your community is doing okay. We had some others registered today from Alberta who live in Calgary, which is one of the communities most affected by the flooding. And I don't imagine they're back at work, maybe even the end of this week. We'll have to see how it goes. Where I live, we didn't get any flooding, but watching Calgary especially, the flood, if you saw the clips on the news, went up to 8 or 9 rows within the Calgary Saddle Dome. It was quite amazing. So our thoughts go out to our colleagues in Alberta who've been affected by this. So relevant to today's webinar, I just want to give you a bit more perspective on the background I bring to today's webinar. My background in health equity, my master's thesis was on health equity, and after I finished school, I was able to be a contributing author to a health equity lens report that was developed in British Columbia, as well as being a contributing author to a public health agency in Canada and World Health Organization project on country case studies, health equity through intersectoral action. I've also worked in a variety of ways on the root causes of health inequity, including autonomy or control of destiny, as people refer to it, and the various influences on it. So today's webinar, as we mentioned at the beginning, is about walking the talk for organizations working on health equity. Organizations working to advance health equity often look to themselves and ask, what can they do to show leadership and help build support for health equity work? Or in other words, what can they do to model a health equity approach? Now, in very general terms, organizations working on health equity tend to follow an approach something similar to this. First, finding an internal champion for the issue, someone who can raise its profile within the organization, make a case that a health equity approach is important, worth pursuing, and opening doors within the organization for those conversations and for the work to happen. Second, conducting research, building a case for the benefits of adopting a health equity approach. Third, publishing a report on health inequities in your geography and issuing a call to action of some sort. Fourth, developing tools and processes for staff to apply to reduce health inequities that are caused by health practices and services if you're a health organization. And then fifth, working to build a network of stakeholders to work collaboratively on reducing health inequities by focusing on the external or social determinants of health and on public policy strategies. Again, this is a very general approach, but often organizations who are working on advancing health equity follow an approach somewhat similar to this. These are all good, natural, and very necessary steps. However, the essence of health inequity from an organizational perspective is still missing. And this is what we'll focus on today. Now, this takes us back to the roots of the field of health inequity as we know it today, specifically to the Whitehall studies, to remind us of some of the insights from this work, and then it transports us into the field of management to discuss evidence-based insights from that field that can help us address the concepts Whitehall identified as important and help organizations more effectively model a health equity approach. For you see, what Whitehall did when it pointed to root causes of health inequity was to paint a target for intervention that lay outside of public health's normal operating range. We don't have tools in our toolbox for doing that kind of work. It's more natural for public health to analyze data and advocate for public policy than to follow the logic from Whitehall to the interventions it indicates. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the beginning, just so we're all on the same page. Much of our understanding of health equity, particularly the health gradient, comes from the Whitehall studies. The original Whitehall study of 18,000 men in the UK civil service demonstrated that those in the lowest employment grades were much more likely to die prematurely than men in the highest grades, and that the relationship was graded. For each step up the organizational hierarchy, the risk of death decreased. The Whitehall 2 study was set up to investigate what causes this gradient. It's yielded a treasure trove of research, over 500 publications last I looked, and added to our understanding of how the work or organizational environment affects health. For example, it is commonly understood that stress at work is a major concern, with stress being identified as the #1 cause of lost time at work. Now, summarizing from a Whitehall report, I'd like to quote directly from it. Quote, "Conventional wisdom has it that a stressful job is one characterized by a high degree of pressure and responsibility. New research, to which Whitehall 2 has contributed, notably shows that this is incorrect. A way of thinking about stress at work that more closely accords with people's experience is that it results from an imbalance between the psychological demands of work on the one hand and the degree of control over work on the other. Many jobs involve high demands. It is not demands themselves that are the major cause of illness, although high demands are independently associated with ill health. It is the combination of high demand and low control. The two elements of work that go into the measurement of control are degree of authority over decisions and use of skills, including opportunity for developing skills. While it is common for demands to increase as the occupational hierarchy is ascended, degree of control over work decreases with lower position. Whitehall 2 provides ample documentation of this. The lower the grade of employment, the less control over work. This combination of imbalance between demands and control predicted a range of illnesses. The evidence from Whitehall 2 suggested that low control was especially important. People in jobs characterized by low control had higher rates of sickness absence, of mental illness, of heart disease, and pain in the lower back. We'll come back to these in a bit. Of course, people are not randomly allocated to jobs and to some extent self-selected. Whitehall 2 showed that the association between low control and increased risk of heart disease, for example, was independent of a range of personal characteristics of individuals. The implication was that the relationship related to the way work was organized and the opportunity it gives people for control, rather than to any characteristics of the individuals in those jobs." End of quote. That's a long quote. Let's just summarize the key points from it quickly. First, workplace stress is a key causal factor, and it's expressed differentially across an organization's hierarchy. Second, workplace stress is caused by an imbalance between demands at work and the degree of control over work. I know there's other theories out there as well, such as effort-reward imbalance, and others that help explain the causes of workplace stress. We're not going to comment on all the theories today. We're going to focus on demand and control and the balance between them. And then third, control over work, focusing on the degree of authority over decisions and opportunities for developing skills. So consider your own work environment and how or whether the structure of your organization creates workplace stress for you. And keep that in mind as we continue today's webinar. Now, it's not a stretch to acknowledge that none of these concepts are public health topics, but rather much more closely align with the fields of management and organizational behavior. But health equity is a public health concept. Therefore, the convergence of these create an opportunity for cross-disciplinary thinking and working that can make modeling a health equity approach much more effective for an organization. So what can we learn from the fields of management and organizational behavior about addressing workplace stress, hierarchies, and balancing control and demands? Every organization has a hierarchy or organizational structure. It's a defining characteristic of being in an organization. However, some organizations have a smoothly functioning hierarchy, while others have a dysfunctional, bureaucratic, and even harmful hierarchy, one that increases workplace stress and contributes to health inequity among its own people. For an organization looking to model a health equity approach, its own hierarchy or structure must be a priority and focus. There are multiple ways of doing this. One particularly interesting way is by replicating the Whitehall study as an internal organizational study. Now, if we view the Whitehall study simplistically, it demonstrated a pattern of health by occupational grade within an organization. Now, if we strip the Whitehall findings away, the structure remains of a hierarchy, which all organizations share, and which any organization could define as it best fits them. Then it's a simple matter of tailoring it to your own organization, of choosing data to report on, either from existing health and safety and performance data sets you already track and measure, or find new indicators you'd like to track and report on. And report on your own gradient in health within your own organization. Now, if you follow this process through, the outcome is owning the gradient as an organization, owning the fact that one's own organization structure and operations contribute to health inequity, and therefore must be a focus for advancing health equity. It changes the conversation. It is no longer about frontline program staff and policies and how they work with their populations. It's about everyone, everywhere within an organization. That is the power of the gradient. What this also does is create a sense of urgency within an organization for health equity work. A sense of urgency is important. John Cotter, a former professor at Harvard University, identified the sense of urgency as the first and foundational step for any successful change management strategy. Without it, change is difficult, if not almost impossible. And advancing health equity requires a lot of change in programs, processes, and policies. So the sense of urgency generated by the realization that health equity is not about patients and their health, or employees and where they live, but it's much, much bigger, about everyone who comes to work and experiences working within your organization. This urgency is energizing for this work. It takes equity from a fringe issue seeking support to a core organizational issue, touching and touched by everyone. So once the sense of urgency has been established to address an organization's gradient, how should this be done? Now, returning to the learnings from Whitehall, an appropriate focus is on the level of workplace stress experienced corresponding to the degree of employee autonomy, looking for that imbalance between employee autonomy and demands at work which creates the workplace stress. And again, what makes this focus work is the sense of urgency, as it requires change, sometimes painful change, to an organization's culture, practices, and styles. The reality is that many organizations create, nurture, and otherwise fail to address risk factors and determinants of health inequity for their own staff that are caused by their own organization and that are within their control. Now, as we've discussed, these risk factors and determinants are expressed predominantly through the experience of workplace stress. Revisiting the lessons from Whitehall, it is commonly thought that a stressful work environment is associated with a high degree of pressure and responsibility. However, we now know this is not the case. Stress at work results not from pressure and responsibility, but from how work is organized and how this influences the demands of work on the one hand and the corresponding degree of control over work on the other. Research shows from Health Canada that workers who experience low decision latitude and high demands become subject to high stress at work. These conditions are associated with more than double the rate of heart and cardiovascular problems, more than triple the rate of back pain, higher rates of repetitive strain injuries, higher rates of anxiety, depression, and demoralization, higher levels of alcohol, prescription, and over-the-counter drug use, and higher susceptibility to a wide range of infectious disease. Taking a complementary perspective and examining it from a different theory's lens, research shows that workers who experience an imbalance between effort and reward experience sustained stress reactions. In the same Health Canada report, they found these conditions were associated with triple the rate of cardiovascular problems, triple the rate of back pain, higher rates of repetitive strain injuries again, and higher rates of anxiety, depression, and conflict-related problems. Now, the mechanism of workplace stress has also been linked in other reports to a fifth of absenteeism costs, about a third of short-term and long-term disability costs, over half of workplace accidents, and just under half of the costs associated with staff turnover. Stress, while clearly important, is often thought of as a characteristic of individuals. It is experienced by individuals, this is true, but is done so as a reaction to external forces. Targeting these external forces offers a more productive, sustainable approach. Organizational hierarchy is an external force that has a huge impact on workplace stress. However, hierarchy, as we discussed earlier, is a defining characteristic of organizations and cannot easily be changed. What can be changed is its expression by focusing on control and demands within the organizational system and optimizing their balance. So how does this work? Author Daniel Pink describes how this could look within an organization. And I quote, "People want to be accountable, and that making sure they have control over their task, their time, their technique, and their team is a pathway to that destination. Autonomy leads to engagement. Even in low autonomy jobs, employees can create new domains for mastery." End of quote. Now, as increasing personal autonomy becomes an organizational priority, the expression of hierarchy becomes less harmful as employees become more engaged, are motivated to increase their mastery over their work, hence its quality and impact, and reduce the nature and extent of adverse experiences referred to earlier. Now, mastery, mentioned by Daniel Pink, is worth some specific attention. Peter Senge from MIT commented on mastery, and I quote, "Sadly, the term mastery suggests gaining dominance over people or things. But mastery can also mean a special level of proficiency. A master craft person, for instance, doesn't dominate pottery or weaving, but the craft person's skill allows the best pots or fabrics to emerge from the workshop. Similarly, personal mastery suggests a special level of proficiency in every aspect of life. People with a high level of personal mastery share several basic characteristics. They have a special sense of purpose that lies behind their vision and goals. For such a person, a vision is a calling rather than simply a good idea. They see current reality as an ally, not an enemy. They have learned how to perceive and work with forces of change rather than resist those forces. They are deeply inquisitive, committed to continually seeing reality more and more accurately. They feel connected to others and to life itself, yet they sacrifice none of their uniqueness. They feel as if they are part of a larger creative process, which they can influence, but cannot unilaterally control. People with a high level of mastery live in a continual learning mode. They never arrive." End of quote. So summarizing from his teaching, mastery equals proficiency, and mastery does not necessarily equal experience, as people with a high level of mastery live in a continual learning mode. It can therefore be good business practice to identify people for projects not just based on their experience, but based on their ability to learn. If you remember, this is also consistent with the Whitehall study, which defined opportunities for learning as one of the key components of autonomy at work, or control over one's work environment. Now let's return to Daniel Pink. He summarized autonomy as it relates to business and organizations. Some key findings he talks about in his writings include Researchers find greater job satisfaction among employees whose bosses offered autonomy support, consisting of seeing issues from the employee's point of view, giving meaningful feedback and information, providing ample choice over what to do and how to do it, and encouraging employees to take on new projects. Another example, a Cornell University study of 320 small businesses, half of which granted workers autonomy and half of which relied on top-down direction, found that the businesses that offered autonomy grew at 4 times the rates of the control-oriented firms and had 1/3 the turnover. Another example, the lack of individual discretion at work has been identified as the main explanation for declining job productivity and job satisfaction. And one last point, increasing autonomy creates the intellectual space from which good ideas grow. If you're familiar with Google and their 20% rule, it gives their engineers autonomy, and Gmail is one of the products that came from that experience. Autonomy is clearly important. And remember, the experience of autonomy changes as one moves up the organizational hierarchy. There's an increase in autonomy the closer to the top of an organization one is, resulting in a stronger balance between workplace demands and autonomy, which balance lowers workplace stress. What exactly is autonomy? Daniel Pink makes clear that it is not empowerment or flex time, as those are just looser forms of control. He cites William McKnight, president of 3M in the 1930s and 40s, whose credo was, "Hire good people and leave them alone," and wrote that those men and women to whom we delegate authority and responsibility, if they are good people, are going to want to do their jobs in their own way. Daniel Pink also refers to Seth Godin, who said, "As an entrepreneur, I'm blessed with 100% autonomy over task, time, technique, and team. Here's the thing. If I maintain that autonomy, I fail. I fail to ship, I fail to excel, I fail to focus. I inevitably end up either with no product or a product the market rejects. The art of autonomy is picking your limits. That's the autonomy I most cherish, the freedom to pick my boundaries." Autonomy, therefore, it's not unfocused freedom, disorganization, or chaos. It's the ability to choose how to work. It requires trust in people that their best interest is in doing their work better and in the most effective way possible. It requires trust, a fundamental to good business and organizational performance. Daniel Pink describes further, encouraging autonomy doesn't mean discouraging accountability. People must be accountable for their work, but that it builds not on the assumption that if given freedom, people will shirk their work, but on the assumption that people want to be accountable, and that making sure they have control over their task, their time, their technique, and their team is a pathway to that destination. There are a number of concrete things an organization can do to increase levels of autonomy. Some examples include conducting an autonomy audit of your organization, aligning your organization's vision with your people's vision so that increased autonomy benefits your purpose, developing accountability structures consistent with increased autonomy, developing incentives consistent with increased autonomy, coaching leadership to increase autonomy within your leaders' areas of responsibility, working to create a culture of increased autonomy. We'll consider each of these briefly. First, idea of an autonomy audit. As described by Daniel Pink, an autonomy audit simply seeks to answer the question, how much autonomy do the people at your organization, department, or team really have? It typically asks about employees about their own autonomy over time, task, team, and techniques, although additional dimensions or issues could be explored as well. Its findings are often a surprise to those in authority who have a different perception of their organization. But the data it creates can be a compelling change catalyst. And consistent with the idea of autonomy, many of the ideas for how to increase autonomy come from employees themselves in a bottom-up fashion. Aligning vision. The risk of increasing autonomy, the perceived risk of increasing autonomy and losing control, can be mitigated by a shared vision. We return again to Peter Senge. Described by Peter Senge, quote, "When there is a genuine vision, as opposed to the all too familiar vision statement, people excel and learn, not because they are told to, but because they want to. What has been lacking is a discipline for translating individual vision into shared vision. End of quote. Some insights into that discipline come from his writings as well. Quoting again, shared visions emerge from personal visions. Visions that are truly shared take time to emerge. They grow as a byproduct of interactions of individual visions. The visioning process is a special type of inquiry process. It is an inquiry into the future we truly seek to create. In recent years, many leaders have jumped on the vision bandwagon. They developed corporate vision and mission statements. They've worked to enroll everyone in the vision. Yet the expected surges in productivity and competitiveness often fail to arrive. This has led many to become disaffected with vision and visioning. The fad cycle has run its course, and the baby is about to be thrown out with the bathwater. The problem lies not in shared visions themselves, so long as they are developed carefully. The problem lies in our reactive orientation toward current reality. Vision becomes a living force only when people truly believe they can shape their future. The simple fact is that most managers do not experience that they are contributing to creating their current reality. They don't see how they can contribute toward changing that reality. End of quote. So the antidote to the problem of shared vision appears to be engagement in the sense of seeing one's contribution, which in turn is fed by autonomy. So autonomy and a sense of shared vision feed each other through the intermediate construct of engagement. Accountability for autonomy. Now, accountability consistent with decreased autonomy would focus not on compliance, but on engagement. It would seek to explore what an employee is passionate about, can create and bring to the table, rather than just focus on how well they can complete the assignments given to them at the table. It would also hold managers responsible for the level of autonomy in their team. Autonomy is not command and control. It requires legitimate authority over decision-making and opportunities for learning and growth, for taking calculated risks. But this is where innovation comes from and where progress occurs. Incentives. Incentives can help increase autonomy, but the wrong incentives can actually harm autonomy and organizational behavior. Research into behavioral economics and incentives has shown that carrot and stick incentives only work for rudimentary logarithmic tasks, but when cognitive functioning is required, these same incentives can actually reduce performance. What works instead is to focus on intrinsic motivation, around the desire to do things because they matter, because people like it, and because it's interesting, because it's part of something important. And this revolves around the principles of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Or in other words, one can incentivize autonomy by unleashing autonomy in ways that increase personal mastery and in line with the person's sense of purpose. Leadership. Increasing autonomy requires a special type of leadership, one that can let go of control and command. Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, described this type of leadership as level 5 leadership. And I quote, "Level 5 leaders are ambitious first and foremost for the cause, the organization, the work, not themselves, and they have the fierce resolve to do whatever it takes to make good on that ambition. The level 5 leader displays a paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will." End of quote. Level 5 leadership can be coached if there is a willingness to learn, to develop mastery, or in other words, to increase one's own autonomy. The paradox: we can increase the autonomy of others by increasing our own, as this includes defining one's own boundaries and techniques for work. These are just some examples of how autonomy could be increased within an organization. And increasing autonomy serves to reduce the adverse effects associated with the harmful hierarchy. So let's return to where we began. The reality, even for many working to advance health equity, is that many organizations create, nurture, and otherwise fail to address risk factors and determinants of health equity for their own staff that are created by their own organization and within their control. By following the ideas and principles discussed today, an organization can effectively model health equity by owning the fact that one's organization's structure and operations contribute to health inequity, and therefore must be a focus for advancing health equity. It is no longer just about frontline program staff and policies. It's about everyone everywhere within an organization. That is the power of the gradient. Taking the time to affect change within will be a major influence in and of itself on the change in health equity the organization wants to effect externally. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're just touching on some of these concepts briefly today to give you some insights into how an organization can more effectively model health equity. I'd like to open up now for some questions and answers and discussion. Let me change the meeting.
All attendees are unmuted.
So if you have a comment or question, I've changed the meeting option now so everyone is unmuted. You can go to the My Mood icon and raise your hand and feel free to speak. Or you can type in a question in the chat window there on the left. So are there any questions or discussion ideas that you wish to cover today? Scrolling through the list of participants. See the health equity team from Alberta Health is there. Hello. I hope the flooding hasn't affected you too personally or deeply where you live and where you work. Did you have a question, health equity team?
Hello?
Hi there, I can hear you.
Okay, great. It's Julie from Sudbury and District Health Unit. So
Hi.
we're sitting together as a management team on and we're wondering what would be the process to bring our entire senior leadership level.
Sorry, your question broke up. Could you try and ask it one more time? Apologize. Julie writes, I'll try to type it. Perfect. Apologize. Sometimes the audio isn't 100% on webinars, but I'll wait for you to type it. So as she's typing, the health equity team types the question. Their question is, how does an organization transition from being more focused on control to one that is focused on autonomy? Great question. I think the key to that transition, it's not in data, it's not in reports. It goes back to that sense of urgency we talked about before. John Cotter, when he studied change in hundreds of organizations, all the successful change initiatives were driven by a sense of urgency. All the ones that weren't successful lacked that sense of urgency. Now, if you picture a health equity approach within an organization, often the people that work day to day know what needs to happen and where it needs to happen within the organization. But getting others to see things the same way, to buy into that, can be a challenge. Without a sense of urgency to others, a health equity lens or health equity approach is just something else that's come across their desk that requires them to react to it. And naturally, they treat it with some skepticism. Is this another flavor of the month? How should we react to this? How should we perceive this? So John Cotter talks about that sense of urgency. That sense of urgency has to be there. And the reason I focus today on the idea of an organization replicating Whitehall as its own internal study is it helps everyone see how they're part of the problem and therefore part of the solution. If a manager or a senior management team and part of the organization can see how their very structure and how they operate contributes to workplace stress and contributes to the gradient, however you measure it within your own organization, then hopefully what sinks in is, my goodness, we're part of the problem. This isn't a program focused outside the organization on the people we serve. This is a program, this is something we need to own, something we're causing all by itself. To me, that's a compelling way to help make it urgent. there's other ways to possibly make it urgent. But really, as I've studied this and worked on it over the years, that seems to be the most compelling way to create that sense of urgency. The health equity team added a second part to the question: how do you take health equity beyond the individual organization? Is your strategy to get each organization to focus on reducing health equity within their organization? If so, that is brilliant. Good question. If you look at intersectoral action as an example, how do you work beyond your own organization? The case studies we reviewed, for the Public Health Agency and the World Health Organization back when we did that report, they talked about many different success factors. If you review the report, they're identified there. One of the ones they talked about was creating a compelling case for people to participate. And that's really synonymous with John Cotter's sense of urgency. Most organizations will come to a meeting table once, but whether or not they return and whether or not they participate meaningfully depends on, do they see themselves, an urgency for themselves to do that? Do they see themselves as part of the problem and part of the solution? So imagine an intersectoral collaboration where every organization is focusing on their own internal gradient and how to reduce it, and at the same time is also focusing externally on public policies, on determinants of health, on other things that they see in the community or the area where they exist. It'll create a much more powerful intersectoral collaboration. Julie from Sudbury, the question typed in: any thoughts about how our control hierarchy also influences externally focused work with partners? Great question. If I'm understanding your question correctly, what you're asking would be, your organization has a command and control hierarchy that affects your ability to work externally with other organizations and partners. Would I be rephrasing that with the correct understanding, Julie? Okay, thanks. And it's a great point. And again, it comes back to the people that work on this issue. They know what needs to happen. They know where it needs to happen. But actually helping it happen is difficult. And that's part of the letting go of control that needs to happen. Anytime as a senior management team or person, if you're letting your direct reports out to work with external partners, you're really trusting them. You're really letting them go. You're taking the leash off and saying, go and do this work. So there's definitely an influence between them. We touched on trust. There's books written about trust and how trust is a leadership characteristic and an organizational characteristic. And you can see how if trust is present in an organization, a lot can happen. If trust isn't quite where it should be in an organization, it's difficult for people to let go of control. That's why when we talked about different steps that you could take to focus on autonomy, we started with an autonomy audit. So it really creates an interesting picture of, what is the manager or the senior manager's perception of control in their area, but then asking each employee to rate their experience with autonomy. And if you compare those results, and see how the perception differs, that's an eye-opening conversation. It can help senior management or management say and realize, wow, things aren't how I thought they were, and start to focus on how can we increase autonomy within an organization. And when you link autonomy back to successful business practices, and we touched on some of those today, but there's more in the literature, you can see how it could be a leverage point for improved performance in many different ways. So if you find you have a control hierarchy that makes your health equity work difficult, focusing on trust, focusing on other ideas as a way to start to lessen the command and control structure can be helpful to opening that door. Thelma Maxwell from Windsor, Ontario asks, are there any health units that have replicated the Whitehall studies? Great question. If you look at the literature on health inequity, there are many, many studies that have replicated the gradient in health in Canada, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in different countries around the world. Have any of them been health units, like a local health unit? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. None are popping to mind. I think that the opportunity is to be those studies, to make that contribution to the literature and to our field of working on health inequity. That's something I believe strongly in. I'd be excited to work with anybody who wanted to explore that and what that would look like. Are there any additional questions or comments on modeling a health equity approach? I'm not seeing any additional questions. So I'd like to thank you for your questions and the interest shown in your topic today. I'd just like to mention a few things in closing before you sign off. We have recorded today's webinar. We'll put it up on our website in our webinar archives later today. Now, I mentioned autonomy and Google's 20% rule. We have our own expression of that rule. We call it our 4-hour rule. And simply what it means is every week we dedicate at least 4 hours to talking with people who work in the field of solving health or social problems. So what that means for anybody on this webinar is if you found this topic interesting, or if you have additional questions we haven't covered in today's webinar, or if you'd like to explore the concept in greater detail, we're available to do that through our 4-hour rule. My email is there on the screen. It's as simple as contacting us, and we can go ahead and set up a time to have a conversation. And we do this completely free. It's just part of how we work and fulfill our mission of serving those who are working to solve social and health problems. And we also have an evaluation form for today's webinar that we'll be sending out by email. It's very brief, 7 questions. If you take the time to complete it, we would greatly appreciate it. So thank you again for your participation today. I look forward to future conversations with you about modeling an approach to health equity and to possibly seeing you again in our continuing series of webinars for those working to solve health and social problems. Again, my name was Steve Peterson. I'm your webinar host for today. I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.